I'm really thrilled about this panel for several reasons. For one thing, the moderator is one of my Duke Law colleagues who is also with Intel Corporation. We managed to bring down the super smart Harry Schwartz, who's going to be sharing with us. My old friend Larry Wells. General Wells is an authentic fighter pilot. And if you know anything about Air Force fighter pilots, I am like really in awe that he is now a cybersecurity specialist. And I do know, Larry, at our law school, and I wish I had brought it down, just yesterday, one of our two of our faculty members published a brand new text on intellectual property, music copyright, and it's entirely a comic book. And I'm thinking this would be
fighter pilot's book.
It's a fighter pilot's book.
I'm with you.
Kristen is from UCLA. She's one of the smartest young up-and-coming scholars. And in fact, Kristen, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but one of your works entirely unrelated to what you're doing today, it's on hostage rescues and so forth, is mandatory reading in my use of force class.
Thank you.
And Mary Rose, it is terrific to have you here from University of North Carolina. And she and I were at UNC, had a great cyber conference as well, and she critiqued my paper, and I said, be gentle, and she was, but she did really a great job. And what's so exciting is we're looking at different ways we can collaborate with UNC and going forward. So it's just very exciting. Over to you, David.
Charlie, thank you so much. Really excited to be here. The future of cybersecurity. It's a broad topic. We're really going to try to point forward and look to where things are going. Well, it's also the opportunity for us to tie some of the private sector cybersecurity to things that are happening in government and things that government can do. We really wanted to make this as interactive as possible with the panel and to tease things out and then to leave a bunch of time for questions. So I have a scenario that I'm going to describe, and then we're going to start digging into the scenario and use it as a way to provide some guidance here. So here's the scenario. Skew Research is a political polling company that does work for political candidates and media companies. 2 weeks ago, their Chief Information Security Officer, their CISO, noticed some anomalies in the network traffic that appeared to indicate someone external to the company had unauthorized access to the servers containing Skew's raw Senate candidate polling data that is weekly shaped into reports for candidates and the media. The CISO reached out to Group Hit Cybersecurity, a private sector cyber investigations group, for assistance with forensics, and was told that it appears someone has had access for quite some time. Group Hit told the CISO that they believe it was a nation-state attack, and it appears polling data had been changed in the database for at least 6 months. So Ari, I want to direct the first question first to you and then hear the entire panel's thoughts on this. The CISO doesn't know whether to trust Group Hit's ability to attribute the attack to a particular nation state. What should she do?
Well, attribution has been getting a lot better than it had been, and the private sector, I think private sector tools are part of the reason for that. But it's still pretty hard to do, and in fact, in the J.P. Morgan Chase attack in 2014, J.P. Morgan Chase was relying on a cybersecurity vendor that told them that they had been hit by a nation state. They said it was Russia at the time, and the U.S. government told them that it was not Russia, that it was a criminal operation, and they fought back and forth in Bloomberg and in Reuters, basically arguing back and forth if nation state, not nation state. Now, companies have a lot of reasons to want it to be a nation state. First of all, they can get more help from the government if it's a nation state, and they also probably have a little less liability if it's a nation state. So there are some reasons that they might want it to be a nation state, but they might want to go discreetly to the government first, bring it to the FBI first before trying to have this argument, make a claim that it is a nation state that's hit them if this is going to become public.
I was just going to add, I wonder from a PR perspective whether it also helps a company to be able to attribute to a nation state versus a criminal. It just maybe it's more sympathetic if they're being, under attack and part of some, international tensions rather than just criminal.
I think the attribution part is the most difficult by far. You can go online and if you want a Russian, Chinese, Iranian malware, malicious software, you can buy it. They'll actually tailor it to whatever group you want it to come from. You can go online. You can use your virtual private network to send it from an IP address anywhere in the world. Much more difficult to attribute. I think, quite honestly, the easiest way to have attribution would be some type of human intelligence. If you're just looking at the code, if you're looking at the IP address, if you're looking at the information associated with it, that can all be very easily changed and modified to point to whoever you want it to, or in some cases to point it to yourself. And then you can come back and say, well, it wasn't me, and then look at the code and show that it could have been somebody else. It's really a very deceitful, devious business using code and using that as the sole indicator of attribution.
Well, one thing you just pointed out there is the way in which sometimes the private sector attributions and eventual government attributions, to the extent that they are publicly announced, are in some ways complementary. So one thing we've seen repeatedly over the course of the last several years, including with the DNC hack, is that the first attribution out of the box is a private sector attribution. And often those private sector, the cybersecurity companies that are announcing that their client has been hacked by a state-sponsored actor, are providing somewhat more detail than the eventual government attribution, which in some cases comes months later. So the government has access to more sources. They've got the human intelligence. On the other hand, they also have to worry about sources and methods in a way that maybe the private sector cybersecurity companies don't.
So did I hear you correctly, though, that you think attribution is actually getting easier to do, that the ability of companies to do these kinds of forensics is actually improving?
Companies have gotten better, and I mean, there's more information sharing out there about technologies, tactics, and other things you can pick up along the way, right? And so that info sharing has helped, I think, to get companies in the private sector faster up to speed and to be able to identify it. There is still the problem that, code is shared, right? So you can't be 100% certain. But, some of the basic information, though, tying it across and having several different checks, I think is helpful. A lot of the private sector folks are former IC folks at this point. It's hard to keep folks in the IC these days that do cyber because they get paid a lot in the private sector to do this work in the private sector. So you have people that were doing it in the government now doing it in the private sector, so you know that the quality is the same as what you're going to get from the government. The thing you're missing, as others have said, is the human intelligence and signals intelligence that might help you along the way to tie it back to other folks.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the political dynamic of that also, that you have these private sector companies that might come out with an attribution and have an incentive to get into the press, to get their name out there and attributing an attack, where at least in one example that you were providing, Ari, it may not be an accurate portrayal of who that is. And what are the implications of how that impacts the government, and whether the government then needs to play a role given potential political backlash when it's in the press that a foreign nation state may be attacked?
It definitely goes both ways. I think companies want to get out there and show that they're further along in this space and show off that they've can do attribution, and obviously sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. And so I think that can be harmful. It can be harmful to a government investigation. On the other hand, I mean, the last speaker was talking as though the U.S. government had just given away its sources and methods to the Chinese, when in reality, they were just saying exactly the same thing that the private sector had done. When the U.S. government turned over information to the Chinese and said, "We know it's you," it was the same tactics and methods that the private sector had already shown and had already made public. So it wasn't as if, from their own private investigation, so it wasn't as if it was the U.S. government turning over its sources and methods. They were turning over the sources and methods of private companies that had already published that, and it was widely known publicly what they had done. So it is helpful in that way, because if then the U.S. government doesn't have to burn its sources and methods for its second and third check, but can utilize things that are already publicly widely available in order to turn to a country and point the finger. So it goes both ways.
I mean, I think another way it looks as though it's been helpful to the government to have the private sector attributions is if you think about the Office of Personnel Management hack. The U.S. government has never officially attributed that intrusion to China, but private sector cybersecurity firms have. So the government hasn't come out with an official statement, but that's hanging out there from some fairly credible companies that China was responsible for it. So private
Well,
sector
the Director of National Intelligence didn't deny it either. So.
He didn't deny it. In fact, appeared to applaud it in certain, recognizing the game. But in some ways, you see the private sector sort of stepping up faster and maybe filling in gaps where the government doesn't necessarily want to release information.
Therefore, maybe taking some pressure off of the government from having to publicly state it while still creating a bit of a disincentive to let people know that folks are actually being caught doing the attack.
I would imagine it goes both ways. I mean, on the one hand, the government might appreciate not having to or point the finger at a particular country and avoid escalation of international tensions. But on the other hand, the fact that the private companies are so involved now, I think we've heard this already today, in these state-sponsored attacks of some sort, that then the U.S. looks like is not doing anything. And this was something the subject of General Dunlap's paper at UNC, the government's not acting. And so I think it can go both ways, a positive and a negative, obviously, if a private company labels or points the finger at a country.
But David, to your point, I think you're asking, do private companies have an incentive to find certain outcomes? And the answer is yes. And you'll even look at certain companies that are always focused on a specific threat all the time, and they tend to find information that supports that threat as being something that they're gonna want to report on. If you are a CISO, you need to look at multiple sources, multiple methods, and quite honestly, when something happens, there's not a single company that looks at this. It's across the board. You just need to be open on to what are those other options that are being delivered out there.
And it's also not just U.S. companies. Right. So there are Russian companies, Kaspersky is the big one. There's also been a Chinese company recently that's been launching similar attribution reports. They're a little more subtle than some of the ones issued by U.S. cybersecurity companies, but it's an international phenomenon, not just a U.S. one.
Let's build on the scenario a little bit. So now that the CISO has reason to believe SKU's security was breached, she's wondering whether she needs to notify the authorities, and if so, whom? Kristen? You want to take that?
Sure. So which authorities to notify depends a little bit on some of the details of the company, and we've left that deliberately vague so we can talk through the different permutations. But for most companies, you're going to want to notify law enforcement, probably the FBI. But whether you need to do other notifications depends on what kind of a company it is and what was actually taken. So if some of the information that was taken involves personally identifiable information, customer data, credit card information, that sort of thing, then the state data breach laws will kick in, and you'll need to notify the individuals whose information was taken and maybe the state's attorney general. If it's a publicly traded company, the Securities and Exchange Commission has also issued guidance about requiring companies to disclose material cybersecurity risks. And that's been out there since the fall of 2011, but the SEC had never really pushed an enforcement action based on it, but reports are now that they're actually investigating Yahoo over the hacks that have been released in the last few months. So those are some of the authorities that a company would want to consider notifying, depending on, again, their exact profile.
Notification is the key. You'll find most companies that we look at, the first thing they do is they shut down, they go internal, all the shields come up, they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to expose the issues that they've had, and at some point they tend to start letting that information out. The good companies do have connections already with law enforcement, with the FBI. They have people that they can call on a trusted agent basis and get the information out very quickly. That's probably the key, because if that company has been attacked, somebody else is being attacked the same way through the same vectors, and that needs to be shared with the community so people can start shutting down the open holes or the gaps that are out there in their defensive system around their cybersecurity issues.
And from just a very practical perspective for the companies, again, if they had personally identifiable information taken, working with law enforcement is a recognized exception to the notification requirements under state data breach laws. So if you're working with law enforcement and law enforcement allows you to delay, it sort of stops the clock on some other legal obligations.
So maybe we can split these out into two different categories. I think to help add some clarity in mandatory notifications or legally required notifications and voluntary notifications, and when those might be helpful and what the legal consequences of those are. So, Kristen, I think when you were originally responding, I think you were talking about legally required notifications, right?
The data breach laws and the SEC disclosure, yes. Law enforcement, not legally required, but certainly highly legally advisable, I would think.
Do we have any sense of how much we're seeing of mandatory SEC disclosure right now, which would require that it's got to be material, I would assume, for the company?
So a lot of companies have, in response to the SEC disclosure, which was issued in September of 2011, a lot of companies have started putting in something near boilerplate language about how they are subject to a risk of cybersecurity incidents and cyber attacks. And some companies have disclosed in the wake of cybersecurity incidents. But as you said, the trigger for disclosure under the SEC guidance is whether a risk is material. And so that gives companies a fair amount of wiggle room to say, well, we're an enormous company. Even if our exposure from this is tens of millions of dollars, we're so big that that risk isn't material. So there's been a lot of skepticism about the efficacy of the SEC disclosure guidance and whether it's really prompting companies to effectively disclose the risk.
So I was just going to say, 4 years ago, the government wasn't notifying anyone. I mean, it was all going in this direction of you should notify the government. But about 4 years ago, the government started notifying companies. In the first year, they notified 20,000 companies, and it's stayed around that level since that point. And I can tell you, it's something that we really pushed when I was in the administration, that we should be notifying more. And now that I'm on the other side of it, I see the companies coming to us saying, although the FBI called us and told us about this situation, all our W-2s got sent out in order, et cetera, et cetera.
And are these primarily situations where the company themselves did not know that they had been breached until they were notified by the government?
Correct. They did not know. And I think that what we heard almost immediately especially from a lot of large banks, is that's great that you're telling us, but we want to know while we're being hit and not afterwards. And so, which would be really helpful. However, that's a little harder to do, right? I mean, they're monitoring the exfiltration network, and so they can see the data leaving. They're not. What is harder is, in order to be able to stop it, they have to be on people's networks. That said, we're not so good at stopping attacks on government networks, so I can't really say that just because they're on a private sector network that it's going to be successful, number one. And number two is you're going to have the FBI wandering on your network looking for stuff. So I would say this to the CEOs, and they would sort of give me a blank stare as though, well, why can't you just figure out other ways to help us, which would be great. I mean, I think we should continue to do that. But at this point, the FBI does see and other sources that help to inform the FBI see traffic that they can help to notify, but you also need this kind of for the good of everyone, right? We need to be able to notify the FBI when these things are happening, so that they can know what to look for other cases to notify other people. So there is sort of a benefit to everyone if you do notify, but then again, there's this downside of that you are telling law enforcement, telling the Justice Department that you've had a breach, and so you have to be prepared and ready for that to happen. And it takes a little while for companies to get to that point that they're ready to do that. In a lot of cases, they want to do a little of the investigation themselves before that happens.
And it takes a while. The common time frame of once you notify a company it's been breached, they've actually been in the system about 250, 260 days. So when they go back and look at the logs, it's not something that just happened. We saw data exfiltrated, now we know. They've actually been rooting around, creating various logs and doing different things in the system for a very long period of time.
It's great that there's improved communication both from the companies to the government and the government to the companies. What I liked about Kristen's first response is she also mentioned the communications to the consumers who are also directly impacted. And there have been a lot of foot dragging, I know, in revealing to consumers. I think there's again a reputational hit that companies take when they reveal that they've been hacked, and there's a reluctance to go public with that. And then also, what do consumers do with that information once they're told? What kind of steps do they need to take? So there's still a lot of work to be done.
There's a lot of pressure on both sides for companies, I think, when, again, they're put in that situation. They're worried about the reputational risk. They're worried about getting it wrong, because if they notify, 1 million people, and it turns out that 100 million people were breached, and it looks as though this is getting a bigger and bigger issue rather than having the whole thing under control. If they don't do it fast enough, right, the other pressure on the other side, then they go and the regulators or even in some cases Congress say, what took you so long to notify, right? So a lot of times you'll see boards that just want to notify right away. General counsels push back and say, no, but if we do that, there's other pieces of it. So there's this kind of back and forth in terms of where the liability to the brand sits and where the liability is for the company. So it's a constant tension.
Is it even potentially a bit more complicated than that for a lot of these companies, that a lot of the breaches involve vendors or subcontractors, that they're getting information, they're having to get information from them about the forensics of the investigation, depending upon the contract? They may have a limited ability to get that information or do the investigations themselves. How often do you guys see that?
I think it's very common. I mean, and Larry can talk about this more too, but the way that most of these these attacks happen is they take over someone with a lower credential, and it can be a contractor. So in the Target case, it was actually the air conditioning vendor, right? That's how they got in. So, and they worked their way across by raising their access through different types of credentials to the point of sale machines, and then took over the point of sale machines across the country. So we're talking about, I mean, and that it could be that they had a very flat system, or it could just be that these were very well organized and folks that knew what they were doing, adversaries that knew what they were doing. So, but the point is that they come in through these other means, through contractors or through administrators or through people that they can get through a phishing attack in some way, or a water cooler attack, as it's called, where people congregate of a certain kind that they know will get to the types of targets they want to get to. And then they raise their authentication within the company after they have their level of their credentials and their access within the companies, and work their way across the system to get to the networks that they're looking for. So it's very common that contractors are involved, or people that have left the company, or in the OPM case, there were like 4 contractors involved. So.
Yeah, and it's typically about 95% of the breaches occur from within, a contractor, an actual employee, part-time, full-time. It was a government contracting card in OPM that was, the factors there were stolen and reused to get into OPM to establish things. So it does happen. I think that what people don't really realize is most of it is easy things like clicking on a link, or it's somebody who's clicked on a bad email. This is not super secret spies that are sneaking things in the system that you are not aware of. Most of it is an overt act by accident by one of your employees or employers.
Yeah, one of the things we talk to the students here at Duke about with cybersecurity and privacy is recognizing that for a lot of these vendor relationships, they're probably going to be governed by a contract that was likely negotiated by a junior lawyer or potentially by a purchasing agent, maybe vaguely directed by a lawyer at some point. But a lot of the terms and conditions in there that are going to govern how you're going to respond are incredibly important. So being able to guide what kind of language goes into those types of agreements, I think, is going to be critically important over time. But I want to come back to another thing that you were just talking about, which was this idea of the degree to which the government would be allowed by the private sector to be really involved in their network so that they could provide that kind of guidance that you brought up. I have a sense that where we're actually moving to in the future is maybe 3 categories. You've got government systems, and then you've got separate private sector systems. But then in the middle, somewhere, we've got these critical infrastructure systems that the government is going to be more involved with in different ways. We've had the Einstein program and intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems that the government has been encouraging organizations to potentially adopt. And I wonder if anybody can talk about the value that we think that may provide over time.
I mean, I think in terms of intrusion prevention and detection is important, but it's not a panacea. I think there were a number of folks 8, 9 years ago who put it out there. We can protect everything if we just got the government, the indicators that the government has, if we can get them in the hands of the private sector, we'll stop everything. It turns out the private sector has most of those indicators already in one way or another, and in fact, indicators themselves are not really going to be the best way in the future to protect stuff. It just, the attacks are changing too quickly for indicators to be that successful. It's more about behaviors. We know what the bad guys do. We have to watch for what the bad guys are doing on your systems. If you see someone raise their credentials in the system, they try and get this into systems that they shouldn't. That is more indicative than the indicator of how they got in, of how they originally got access. That says that there are going to be bad guys in your system. That's probably true, right? This is not. We're not in a system now where you have where we can put firewalls on the outside and stop people from getting in, right? There are going to be bad guys in the system. The question is, how do you stop them from getting access to stuff that they shouldn't have access to within your system? Make the whole system harder.
I know there's a panel tomorrow, I think, on surveillance. I mean, as soon as I hear the government, I just get really nervous as a civil libertarian that they're, you know, let the government into the private systems. We'll figure it out for you, and that's a concern, right? So that would be my first reaction.
And when I hear that, I love it. Bring me more. The more we can protect and share information. I'm just not kidding.
I know you're not.
But for many people think NIST compliance, National Institute of Standards and Technology, is those standards of compliance will keep you safe and secure, and it's just not true. Compliance is not security for your system. So you can be fully compliant with all of the requirements and all of the dedicated information out there and still be very, very susceptible to attacks.
But, I mean, this is why, I mean, I used to work on NIST, so but this is why NIST doesn't talk about compliance, right? NIST says you can't be compliant to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Right. I think I'm the first person, this is the longest I've been at a cybersecurity conference for the NIST cybersecurity framework to have come up in 3 years. But so the framework is designed to be a risk management tool, right? So what it does is it takes all those standards that everyone says you have to figure out how to comply with, and says, okay, we're going to figure out which ones are most important to us, right? You set a baseline for yourself of where you are today. You've set a target of where you want to get to, and you move to that target. Then next year you reassess as to what's important. It's a risk management tool, and everyone should be doing that. And that is actually the way that now most sectors are looking at this, right? This is not about what can we do to stop bad stuff from happening. We have to stop some bad stuff from happening. We have to be able to respond really quickly. But this is about risk management. We have to think about it more like the weather, right? When the weather, we can prepare for the weather to hit us, but it is going to come at some point, right? There is going to be a hurricane. There is going to be a bad snowfall. We have to be able to respond to that. We can't expect that we can stop all of the cyber incidents that are going to happen in the near future.
Right.
I think implicit in your question, Dave, is also this, again, to go back to the issue of sort of what's the proper role of the government versus the proper role of the private sector. And, you know, going back to John Carlin's speech from this morning, there are instances where U.S. companies are losing against foreign militaries. And that seems like a strange situation. It seems like maybe that's something where it makes sense for the government to defend the U.S. private sector against foreign militaries. But then you think about how are those compromises actually happening, and it's, as you said, sort of low-hanging fruit. These are not foreign militaries deploying their most sophisticated techniques against U.S. businesses. It's actually fairly routine compromises. It's spear phishing. It's not that sophisticated. So when you frame it that way, it seems like, okay, well, this is something the private sector should be able to handle itself through risk management frameworks and other things. So there is this sort of inherent tension about if you focus on who the attackers are, it sounds like it's more of a government role. If you focus on how the businesses are being compromised, it begins to sound more like a perfectly appropriate private sector action.
Right, and I apologize, but I believe in cyber intelligence. I think private companies, just like the government, needs to go out and determine who their adversary, who their threat is against their particular sector. Right now, we're defending boundary layer defense against everything all the time, and companies don't have the money, the time, nor can they hire enough people to analyze the data they're looking at. So you really need to, from a private sector perspective, go out and determine who's targeting you, what's the most likely avenue attack, and you can protect against that a lot and then minimize protection in other areas.
I think that's a great idea. I just think it's devil's in the details on how you go about doing that.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of those details, actually. I think whether we want to call it cyber intelligence or whether we want to call it cybersecurity threat indicator or information sharing between the private sector and government, I think then as we saw this cybersecurity information sharing bills go through Congress, there was a tremendous amount of concern about privacy and civil liberties that was included in that conversation about what kind of information was going to be shared back with the government, what information was the government going to be able to share with the private sector to be able to, where do we stand with that and where are we headed with information sharing in the future?
Well, I mean, the law that passed has a strong set of, what it did is it overrides all of the existing privacy law, right? And then sets new set of guidelines for privacy in this space. That made a lot of privacy advocates really uncomfortable, basically to say, you know, we're gonna override all, notwithstanding any other provision of law, you know, you can share information with the government here. That said, the new guidance that came out, most of the privacy groups ended up applauding, right? So DHS and Department of Justice worked together and build a set of guidance that actually works for this kind of information. So there is, I think we have to see still if it's going to work. As I was saying before, I think the focus on indicators it's not the total solution, right? So, but it is helpful, right? And getting more information is definitely helpful. I still think you're hearing from people now, well, we don't really need the indicators so much, we need we need analysis, right? Okay, well, but if you need analysis, how much what is that information that you're gathering come from to create the analysis? How much personal information is actually involved in that, as opposed to taking all these indicators and building them together to build an analysis? And if none of these indicators have personal information in them, it shouldn't be a problem to do analysis with it. But if there's a whole other set of information, then we do have some privacy issues.
Right. And we're speaking U.S. here. We do a lot of work in Europe, and I can tell you it's completely different. And it's, you will have a threat, you will know what's going on, you can't share it, you can't talk about it because of the individual rights of each one of the different nations who have different privacy laws that they're trying to take into account. And so there are nations that are willing to not look at information you have to provide because it may violate some of their personal or their actual laws of their nations.
On the other hand, Europe is moving in the direction of having more reporting requirements for their own companies. So there's a little bit of
There's a real tension there.
So, Kristen, at the break, you and I were talking a little bit about in this environment around information sharing, where it doesn't look like the government could go all alone to fix a lot of these problems with this global internet network, and the private sector also needs help. What does that relationship between the private sector, particularly private sector cybersecurity vendors, and the government look like over time?
Well, I think it's at this point in many ways a mutually beneficial relationship. I mean, we've already touched on some of the ways that that's true with the attribution reports, and in many ways both sides are benefiting from that. But over time is the harder question, because that's not sort of set in stone. At some point, the sort of private companies' interests may diverge fairly substantially from the government's interests. We're seeing that with not the cybersecurity companies necessarily, but with the consumer-facing companies. We've seen Apple and Microsoft and Facebook sue the government repeatedly over things like access to data stored abroad and pushing back on national security letter disclosures and all sorts of things. So the sort of long-term relationship in this space, I think, is very much up for grabs. And I expect we'll continue to see it be sort of bifurcated between companies that are more security-focused and companies that are more consumer-focused.
It also seems that we're often been talking about the U.S. government having a relationship with U.S. companies. But with this global network, we're going to have companies that are going to have to establish trusted relationships with multiple governments. We just talked about European governments having potentially different sets of priorities, particularly for privacy. And how do you think companies are going to be able to navigate creating relationships that are trusted across those geographic boundaries?
Well, I think companies are, just to reframe your question, they're going to have to create relationships that are trusted with multiple governments. Even companies that we think of as U.S. companies, because they're U.S. incorporated, founded here, mainly operate, their headquarters are here. For the tech companies, for Apple, for others, their biggest growth area is China, or it's India, or it's places abroad. The potential for uptake of their products there is far higher because they've already hit certain saturation levels here. So they have to conceive of themselves as sort of worldwide companies, not as U.S. companies. And that's an issue that became particularly acute for them in the wake of the Snowden disclosures, where cooperation with the U.S. government became a liability for them in a way that it hadn't necessarily been to do it quietly before. So I think it really brought to the fore for them the need to be sort of global citizens as companies and not be seen as U.S. companies. That became a problem.
Right, and I'll just highlight that's not an issue that solely arises in the cyber security context, right? Privacy law generally has been a big issue and of concern for companies operating internationally.
Great concern by those companies because they understand if they're working with a China, for example, that they are at high risk of something happening on their network. They'll typically set up their own enclave that's really between China and a certain part of the company, and they'll kind of blockade the rest of it to keep that a little bit clear, which is a smart way of doing things. But a lot of the smaller companies here in the United States, they're not thinking like that. And in many instances, a sub-vendor may be going through another nation that you're not even aware of that would have access to your network. So it really is part of the disclosure, but then you have to be trusting that the companies that you're working with are telling you everything that they know.
So it's great. We go back to the first part of our conversation. I think what we heard is, hey, you're a U.S. company. You've got to be working with the U.S. government because they're going to have information that you don't have. It's going to be critical. They may know that you've been breached and you won't even know it yet. But, oh, by the way, don't work too closely because then you're going to damage your trusted relationships with these governments.
I think John Carlin talked about that a little bit this morning about how the MLAT treaties work in this space, the legal assistance treaties, and what that means for companies that have faced this kind of tension, right? I think he did a good job of explaining exactly that tension that companies face, and it's tough out there.
All right, let's keep going into our hypothetical and find other places that it's going to be tough out there in the future. We haven't been the beacons of hope yet, but anyway. All right, the CEO demands an immediate information security review with the board and a pre-review with the general counsel to understand the potential for liability. How should the CISO organize the review, and what liability areas should she be concerned about? Larry?
So the initial response is typically some type of incident response checklist or group that the CISO will run, and it should include all the legal as well as the technical, the public affairs, and different aspects of the company all coming together. That typically doesn't happen because what the CISO does is within their own little organization, they'll have a BOGSAT or a bunch of guys or gals sitting around a table, and they look at the checklist and go, hey, I'm supposed to call this person and I'm supposed to call that person. Everybody agree? We all agree. Okay, that's good. They don't actually do it. They don't actually run the checklist. They don't actually think through scenarios or exercises or tabletops. And typically, the first time you are breached is the first time they discover that none of their checklists work and they're not accurate and they're not fully vetted out to what they should be doing. So the initial response is to get the right people in the room. And in many cases, the legal side of it have never attended one of these meetings because they haven't been invited, because they haven't been thought to be brought into this discussion. And I'm thinking more of a company that's not been breached. The exact opposite is once a company is breached, you see the finances increase incredibly to start paying for security. You see teams starting coming in. You start seeing the intelligence and the discussion occurring. So for a company that's been breached before, that they understand the significance to the tune of at least tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And in the case of Sony, it can be close to $1 billion worth of expenditures based on what revenue is lost or security that has to be bought. So when they do bring the team together, initially it's an internal team, David, and they work through the issues that they have internally before they start calling in some of the external people. The right way to do it is have the external, the FBI, maybe Homeland Security, maybe someone else, brought in very, very early on so they're aware and they can open up all the resources that they have to contribute to the initial investigation.
I think a lot of times the CISO doesn't really understand what's going to happen when there actually is a breach, and so they picture it in their head. It's sort of like I was told when I had kids, which is now a long time ago. I assume they still do this. They tell people to have a birthing plan, and then they so you get the birthing plan together, but then you throw it out the window the second that the kid's being born, right? That's basically what the incident response plan is. If you don't bring everyone together beforehand, I mean, to exercise it, especially exercising with outside people involved, right? If it's just an internal discussion, it's not that helpful. Because what happens in a real breach is that CISO thinks they're in charge, but then actually either the general counsel or someone that the board wants to have in charge is in charge. Because remember, each of the board members now has individual liability, right? And so they all lawyer up, right? And then the general counsel has to worry about all these other lawyers that might be getting involved in this as well. They bring in their the firm outside counsel as well. They don't want the CISO running the show at this point. So I think if you have a plan and you've run it and you walk through it, there's a lot more involved with where the general counsel actually is working together cooperatively with the security team as opposed to kind of just pushing them aside.
Right. And typically, the first time the board or the C-suite gets involved is at an actual breach. All these exercises, the training, the what-ifs, the drills that you run through, they're typically not that interested. They just want to hear from the CISO how to go. And the answer is, it always goes well.
So what are the major areas of liability that are likely, as that review is being done, to be the things that the general counsel is going to be most concerned about?
Well, I mean, I just not simply going off of this hypo, but in general, I would assume negligence is going to be one of the big concerns, that there's going to be liability, that they were not acting as they should under the reasonable care standard, and that from their own customers, there could be some liability.
That's true from both customers and employees. Again, depending on what was taken, at the point at which the breach becomes known, then often negligence claims are brought. That's been a little bit of a mixed thing in the courts. So courts have said, courts around the country, the circuit courts are currently split on what counts as an injury in fact for purposes of standing. So many courts had been sort of hostile to claims by data breach plaintiffs, at least ones who hadn't experienced actual fraud of some sort. And so they've been tossing them out until the summer of 2015, the Seventh Circuit in Chicago went the other way on one of those cases. The breach about Neiman Marcus was breached and customer credit card information was lost. And the court established a sort of more plaintiff-friendly standard. So companies that are revealing a breach are very likely to be sued with negligence as one of the claims, and sort of how big of a legal threat that is depends on where in the country they're sued.
Also, I mean, now a lot of the companies have insurance, cyber insurance of some kind, and usually it's the insurance companies that are fighting this out and not the companies themselves. So a lot of times it will be between the general counsel will have to worry about the insurance piece of it as well. A lot of times the CISO wasn't involved in figuring out what the insurance was, so there's confusion around that as well. So there's also just the brand hit as well is a big one that that there's constant worry about, even if you do have insurance. We saw that in several of the retail cases that came out. People worried about the brand hits. And then Kristen talked earlier about the notification standards, et cetera. So there's liability under each of those, depending on which state you're in, and what the rules are and what happened.
Another possible source of liability is the Federal Trade Commission has begun bringing unfair and deceptive trade practices claims against companies that have weak cybersecurity, or against companies that have been saying they have great cybersecurity and actually had terrible cybersecurity. So they've gone after a few companies, and their authority also was a little bit uncertain, but it was upheld, again, about a year and a half ago by the Third Circuit. There's another challenge pending now in a different circuit. But
There's some state AGs that have brought it under unfair and deceptive.
That's true, yeah.
You could have a breach of contract claim, too. Like, one of the things I like to do in my torts class is start with the Ashley Madison hack and talk about how upset some people were when they were revealed to be married and online looking for a little something special on the side.
Well, the breach of contract claims are also, I think, additionally interesting because they could be, most of the lawsuits people have, I think, fixated on with the breaches have been consumer class actions that have been taken up. But now I think we've had class actions that are business class actions. So the banks have actually been plaintiffs in some instances for the cost they've had to do to replace credit cards, for example. And I wonder in situations where you have vendors who have a breach and it impacts many of their clients, whether we're going to see more of that private sector litigation, or whether that's actually just going to be handled as part of the commercial relationships. Does anybody have a view on where you think that might go?
I'm imagining they'll negotiate contracts with an eye towards the possibility of future liability. I don't know whether they are yet. I imagine some are.
We do that for clients.
Yeah.
We,
The best lawyers do that.
yeah, I mean, like, yeah, thank you. I'm not a lawyer, but we'll take it on behalf of
Yes,
the
on
lawyers in our
behalf of your
firm.
firm,
So.
yes.
All right, one last small point on liability. I'm wondering how much any of you think that the Yahoo situation might change the way companies start thinking about the liability, and also getting back to SEC disclosure. I mean, I think the $300 million, is that basically what we're looking at, the change in the purchase price? Because it's hard to argue that that wouldn't be material in that kind of an instance, and it's not clear to me that when the original breach happened, that they would have thought that it was going to result in anything like that. Does this change the game in the future at all?
I think if there is actually, there have been prior SEC investigations. There hasn't been an actual enforcement action based on weak cybersecurity. So that would be a precedent-setting outcome, assuming that it does actually happen. And obviously, this is a very high-profile breach. I think it's in sheer numbers the biggest one in terms of people impacted. And we've seen a very direct hit to the renegotiation of the purchase price, and Verizon's acquisition of Yahoo went down by about $300 million. So it's big in terms of numbers, it's big in terms of money, and it may be big in terms of presidential value.
So we had seen an increase even before the IO case of companies that were putting themselves up for M&A to kind of get a stamp of approval for their practices, so that it wasn't a question in due diligence. I think you're going to see an even greater increase in that after this case.
Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by stamp of approval?
Well, I mean, at least to have someone that, a third party look at your practices. If you could have an ISO, you can get like a literal stamp, an ISO certification, though you follow the ISO practice standards, right? Which is, as I said, doesn't demonstrate that you're fully protected, but it shows you're doing the things that a company of that size is supposed to do. Or it could be the NIST framework that as I said, you have a baseline, you show where you're going to. It's based on what others are doing in your sector. And then have someone say, yeah, we looked at the baseline that they put together based on this and their practices that are out there, and they are in line with what others in this industry, or they're leading for their industry. That kind of, a letter that says something like that is becoming more and more common.
Feels a little bit to me like where I think software vendors were going, recognizing that they were going to have security bugs with their products no matter what they did. So defining secure development life cycles and then putting those in place with a recognition, wait, we've got a process in place. We're not going to catch everything, but it's going to be difficult for people to hold us liable later on if we've had particularly other people outside take a look at our process and say it was the right thing to put in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a risk management process as well, but it's a very similar risk management process. So.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next tweak to our. The board's concerned about the implications for how changed polling data may have already impacted press stories and Senate elections. They asked for a review of impact and options about what to do. Mary Rose, what do you think?
Well, I love this question. Thank you for drafting it this way, David. So I think obviously this is a bit of a spin on the hack of the DNC emails, where we're seeing some concerns that cyber is really impacting our core government functions and perhaps undermining our democratic way of life. And I think this morning the speaker referred to this in part as a weaponizing of information. It's part and parcel of other kinds of attacks. So, but this hypo sets up one that I think we will see, and it's very disturbing. So it's not just stealing data and using it perhaps like social security numbers or credit card numbers, and it's not just using data to harm someone or compromise someone or blackmail someone or a company, and it's not just fake news that is planted to skew public debate, but it's actually the corruption of the original data that's used by our news media industry. And so this is a real deep concern for us. And I mean us as a country, not us as any group I represent. So, I think here for this company, SKU, interesting choice in name. Maybe they don't have a good reputation for straightforward reporting, but perhaps they do. And so this company is going to have to be worried about what it's done. I mean, I would hope a company like this is selling itself as having value, as providing reliable information. And if they're not providing reliable information because they can't keep their information secure, that's really going to impact their business model. One of the very interesting questions here about what kinds of liability they might have in this scenario is very interesting. So it's not obvious how our law would handle this. So particular candidates, for example, might try to sue for defamation, but they're public officials, and they will be hard-pressed to show any sort of actual malice that's a knowing falsehood or reckless indifference to truth or falsity. And the news organizations that have relied on this data, they might have some sort of breach of contract claim, perhaps, but again, if it depends on what kind of level of care this company had in protecting its data. But I think overall the impact is real, even if litigation risk is not, because we have a undermining of our trust in facts. I mean, this is part of what's going on today with this whole fake news discussion, and this hypo is setting up fake news, not just news that we don't like, but actually the facts are incorrect, and that really undermines our ability to engage in reason, democratic dialogue. So on the liability, I think the risk of liability is low, but there's a real concern that if cyber attacks actually corrupt the very data that we have, that's a tremendous and very scary problem for us.
Another way that this is an interesting hypo is on the international level. So the United States has been pushing for a couple of years this norm that there shouldn't be attacks on critical infrastructure during peacetime. And they got the UN group of governmental experts, a group that includes China and Russia, to agree to this norm, which is great. But in the report where the countries agreed to this norm, they didn't define critical infrastructure, which was part of the problem that John Carlin mentioned this morning, why the cybersecurity sanctions executive order had to be tweaked in order to use it in the DNC hack instance, because election infrastructure, turned out, the United States hadn't designated as critical infrastructure. So that was something that happened in early January. But when you look at how the United States defined critical infrastructure, even at the beginning of January to deal with the DNC hack, it's things like polling places, vote tabulation locations, voter registration databases, voting machines. So it's still not clear that this scenario would be covered as critical infrastructure. So the U.S. basis for sort of pointing the finger at the foreign nation state and saying this violates a norm or violates certainly customary international law is pretty uncertain.
Yeah, and so to me, it brings us back to the conversation, I think the dialogue, at least we were having between Larry and Mary Rose. And so if we've got, I think, Mary Rose, you're right, we probably have a low incident in this particular example of individual harm to an individual person, and probably potentially a lot less chance for liability, but potentially large societal harm, right? And so now we've got an entity that we've never would have thought would have been defined within the critical infrastructure category, potentially causing large societal harm because of potentially not have been doing what they needed to do to protect cybersecurity. And is that a great argument for greater government control of or imposition of obligations for cybersecurity on a much greater number of entities?
Well, I mean, one issue that comes up when we start talking about the corruption of information is, well, how will the government act, or even how would private companies act? So in the context, I think tonight's speaker is someone from Facebook, so she may be addressing this, and I don't want to, she's going to know way more than I do. But when it comes to the fake news phenomena, for example, on Facebook, it's not entirely obvious how Facebook can deal with fake news. There are a lot of costs that would come from trying to censor out trying to determine what's fake and what's real, for example. So that is not an easy problem to solve. There's a lot of costs that come from trying to engage in that very enterprise. And then put the government involved. Well, don't get me started. That's very disturbing, because that's the government deciding what's true and not true. And the way our current jurisprudence is set up, that we don't have absolute liability, or there is First Amendment protection for a lot of false speech. It's very limited exclusions for false speech. So that would be a fundamental. We can't say the government has, under our current law, a right to decide what's true and what's not true. And so these kinds of determining what data was corrupted and not corrupted, that's not going to be a very easy thing to determine. Maybe from a computer forensic standpoint, I'm wrong about that, but I would imagine it's a very difficult enterprise. I'm not saying it shouldn't be attempted, but it's fraught with issues.
It's actually very difficult, what you talked about. Mr. Carlin used the example of the large board of data behind him. If you have a cyber attack and that board goes blank, it's pretty easy to say, I think we're under a cyber attack and I'm not going to trust the information. More interesting is, what if you change 1 or 2 bits of information so it's reflecting bad data and you don't know what's good and what's bad? And I also thought back to when he was talking about ransomware. The reason many people are paying the ransom in Bitcoin is because they're hospitals. What they're doing is they're encrypting medical records. They don't have a backup or they don't have additional information. So they have to pay to get this information back because it's kind of a life or death situation. We may not be changing polling data, but what if you're changing medical records? Now what record has been changed, what hasn't? What's the impact across the medical health enterprise? That's why I would like to see a little bit more involvement by experts from the government or by the military who understand this business and do that, as opposed to less. Because once they cross the path of ransomware is encrypting, decrypting, you pay it, I give you your information back, and now they start modifying, changing, deleting, and adding information. Now you really have a difficult time understanding what part of your information, be it critical or not, is accurate and what has been falsified.
Well, I mean, I agree with that, except for that, I'm not necessarily sure that the government is that as good at it as you make it out to be either. I participated
This is supposed to be the beacon of hope portion.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to scare people a little bit here. I'm sorry. But I used to say I didn't want to go into security because you sell fear. But these days, you don't really have to sell fear. You just have to tell people the facts, and people get scared. So I was participating in an exercise when I was at NSC. I was participating in an exercise. This was 2 years ago that the Treasury was doing with the big markets. So this was NYSE and NASDAQ, and we were talking about like what would happen if there was corruption in the data, and how far back would they need to go to? They would have to figure out how far back they would need to go to do their backups, and they were basically saying we'll never have 100% confidence, and we need to know from the regulators how much confidence we can have, and where you'll back us up. Is it 99.9%? Is it 98? And the regulators refused to give them an answer. They would not say. They said, it's going to be all up on you. You're the ones who are going to have to decide how much confidence you have to have in order to restart the markets, which I think is a problem. I think at some point the government should be able to say, we're willing to take on some risk here as the government, but we need the markets to start back up. So I think there is some of those issues that need to be worked out down the road.
Just to go back to one of the examples you mentioned, Larry, with the hospitals and ransomware, the role of the government in that is actually pretty interesting, because why is it that hospitals and other medical providers have electronic health records? Well, it's because they're incentivized to do so by laws and regulations. So there are Medicare and Medicaid regulations that there are both carrots and sticks involved in this, but hospitals and medical providers have transitioned to electronic health records, which of course has tremendous efficiency gains and potentially accuracy gains, but also now has created this risk of malware. So in thinking through regulations going forward, the cybersecurity piece of it should perhaps be a little bit more at the forefront.
So let's talk a little bit about the regulations going forward. The last question from the hypothetical, Ari, the General Counsel has heard that President Trump is considering signing a cybersecurity executive order. She asks whether the executive order will be helpful to prevent these types of attacks in the future.
So,
hope?
I'll say what's in. I'll give some hope here before I crush it again. The EO has 3 parts to it. The draft, at least, they have not put it out. It's taken them quite a while since the day they said that they were going to put it out, and it got delayed. But the last draft that came out has a section on federal systems, protecting federal systems. It holds the secretaries accountable, really for the first time at that kind of high level. There's some legal language that holds them responsible, but they usually delegate it down, and this stops them from being able to delegate it down. That they have to use the NIST cybersecurity framework, as I was talking about before, to do risk management in this space, and that's tied to the budget. So, in order to get their budget approved through the Federal Information Security Management Act, which already ties things through the budget to some degree, FISMA, they have to put together a risk management security plan, and then have this baseline, show where they're going, and have that as part of their budget submission. I think this is a really positive development. It's what the Obama administration encouraged at the end of the Obama administration, but really hard to get secretaries to focus on it when it's the end of their term, and they know that it's the end of their term. Telling your secretaries at the beginning of their term, we're going to hold you accountable for this for your whole time you're there, is really something that is significant in this space. Second is critical infrastructure. There's 3 major studies in there. So we were talking about, Kristen was talking about public companies. There's a study on public companies and the role that public companies should play. It does not mention the SEC, so it'll be interesting as to see how that comes out. There is a study on botnets. So on, you would assume that has to do with the language being changed a little bit. It's about the way it was originally written was about core communications. It seems they want to make it broader. So it's about the whole internet infrastructure and what the kind of new botnet attacks that we've been seeing through the Internet of Things, the Mirai botnet as it's called, what impact they may have and how we could stop that in the future. And then the third is the electric grid, which the electric company is actually very excited about the fact that they're being mentioned directly here. They think it will help to focus some attention and get everyone at the table together. The third area is international, what used to be called open internet, but seems to be moved to more about international norms. As John Carlin said at the beginning, we have some agreement on what international norms are, but that doesn't mean that people are actually going to follow them. So I think this is a little bit more on kind of what are we going to do to make sure that we have the right international norms going forward and how they're going to be enforced down the road. Someone said to me, this sounds exactly like an executive order that you would have written at the end of the Obama administration, and I can't disagree with that. I think we are on a continuum here that started in the Bush administration with the work that they did after a series of hacks that happened to the federal government at that point, that the Obama administration picked up from and moved forward on. In the second term, sort of changed the path to be more risk management oriented, and you're seeing that picked up on from the Trump administration, assuming that the CO gets signed. So you are seeing, there's pretty good agreement in the national security community and in the civilian community about what the direction that we should be headed. I think that's a very positive sign. The downside is, as I was saying before, there's not a silver bullet. We're not solving the problem with an executive order or a law that's passing. I mean, I know that Congress would like to go up and start talking about how great the information sharing law is that they're going to pass and it's going to solve every problem. It's not a silver bullet situation, right? The same way, these are risks that continually come up, that are going to continually come up again and again. We can do a better job of managing them, and we can make it a smaller and smaller problem, but it's not something that's going to go away.
Wanted to open it up now for questions from the audience. Who has a question?
Well, I guess I have some hard questions.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the panel, where do they see biometrics coming in for authentication in the future? I mean, I retired from the Air Force in 2005. We migrated to the CAC card. The CAC card apparently eliminated like 70% of the threats. And then now everybody, I'm sure in this room, has noticed in the last year that your credit card has gone to a smart chip, which Europe was doing years ago. And this summer, I got lucky and met one of the Indian implementers of the national ID card system, where they've got the biometrics and the iris scans. And he was telling me that they've implemented in less than 4 years the whole country, and they've wiped out's not the proper word, but the biometrics has significantly impacted the amount of fraud that they're experiencing and all that. So, I mean, it really boils down to the number one question: who's behind the device, and where do you see biometrics coming into that future?
So this is really a discussion about multi-factor authentication, right? So, and to me, this is, a lot of the incidents we see, we were talking before about how easy it is for people to click on something or fill out a form, right? A lot of people are giving away their username and password, and that's enough to get onto a system. That should not be the case. Passwords are, as my old boss used to say, passwords are broken and should be killed, right? There's no reason we should be using username and passwords at this point. We should be moving on to other things. Now, biometrics are good for certain types of things. I love using it on my phone, right? It's completely great. It's easy to use. Definitely identifies me. But then when my kid wants to use it, it's not there's got to be some fail-safe around it too. So you have to work that out as well. So there are some things that biometrics are good for and some things that they're not good for. It's also a problem that, I don't know how many people got as part of their OPM. First of all, how many people got the OPM message? How many people were hacked through OPM? Most of this room probably, including me, right? How many of you got the message that your biometrics were included in the OPM? So that's about the right percentage. So they actually took the actual image of the biometrics, right, rather than taking the template. They could have just taken the template, but then if they ever needed to upgrade the biometric, then they wouldn't have the actual image to work from. They'd have to get people's fingerprints again. So they took the easy route and kept the image. Now the Chinese government has all of our fingerprints. So it makes it a little bit of a harder sell to say, well, we should be using biometrics everywhere. But for certain things, it's probably okay, right? Even though they have my personal biometrics. So I think we have to figure out when it's useful for, make sure that we're doing it the right way. I still tend to like hardware tokens, the card, the USB token more. In certain cases, the number, the encryption code that comes up through your phone, through the Google Authenticator, et cetera. There are other ways to do it. The callback that people get to do that as well. There are lots of ways to do it. I don't think we should stick on one path, right? I think it's better for security and better for privacy if we have lots of options there.
I agree with Ari that, I think for certain things, biometrics are great and it's much more secure. But again, they can be hacked, and it's a lot harder to change your fingerprint than it is to change your credit card number, right? So once they're gone, they're kind of gone and you're stuck. And states have only just begun to amend their data breach laws to include biometrics. So the states that are sort of more forward-leaning are now saying if a company has your biometrics and they are hacked, they have to tell you. But most states across the country, if they have your biometric data and it's your biometric data that's lost and not your credit card, it's not covered under the definition of personally identifiable information that requires them to tell you.
How about if we go with a question from the overflow room from Grant Schmidt of National Defense University? And Grant's asking, is there concern about the employment of compromised NSA tools against private companies? And is there some responsibility on the part of government to do something about that?
Well, if he's talking about the most recent release, it exposed a lot of zero-day exploits that were unknown or unacknowledged by certain companies. So certainly, if the information's out there, the company needs to acknowledge that, put out the security patches, and fix that right away. I don't know that we tie that to NSA or not, but I think that's what I read in the newspaper, is that it had to do with certain breaches.
Let me follow up with a question. Are the insurance companies, are they doing something in this space? In other words, are they demanding companies do X, Y, and Z? Or are they?
So different insurance companies are all over the map. So I get some of these forms I'd fill out for insurance companies for some of our clients that say, are you using antivirus? Yes or no, and that's pretty much all you have to fill out. And for one of them, I checked no because they are in the cloud. So they're not using antivirus, and they still got insurance, right? It depends how much insurance you're asking for, right? So it didn't even end up mattering. But there are more complicated there are some that do a more complicated check and underwrite, where they involve the underwriters. It's usually very reactionary. So we know, for example, it was very hard to get insurance as a retailer after the Target and Home Depot breaches if you didn't have your point of sale terminal encrypted. But that was after that breach had happened, right? So now everyone has their terminals encrypted, and you can get but that's what they're basing insurance on, that, not all of the other controls, the things that might happen in the future.
And Charlie, I just want to add one thing on the vulnerabilities question, not with respect to the vulnerabilities that were particularly released recently, but I think the overall issue for companies when the government may know of vulnerabilities in their products and whether the government is willing to disclose those vulnerabilities to the companies is a huge issue. And there was a lot of very good work during the Obama administration. Ari did a lot of it around the vulnerabilities equities process and an understanding of a determination of when those should be disclosed to the companies so that they can start working on fixing them. I think we're going to need more conversation on that.
I wrote a paper for the Kennedy School for people that want to look it up on that subject.
Kennedy School, look up one of their papers? Never happened. No, it's excellent.
Let's probably get it blocked.
No, I do think that's the next, the next big thing that we're going to be looking at. Kristen, can I ask you a question? What do you think about the FTC being involved in this space? Stuart Baker's, every time you listen to his podcast, he looks for something to beat them up about. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, as has already been said on the panel, there's no silver bullet solution to this, but the cases the FTC has brought to date have been pretty low-hanging fruit. So they've been pretty egregious. So the case that they brought where the company actually challenged their authority to bring the suits was against Wyndham Hotels. And Wyndham had actually been breached 3 separate times. And
what was their password? Wasn't it like 1, 2, 3, 4? Or
there were default passwords. At least I'm getting this from the court's opinion, which was fairly ungenerous to Wyndham. They were not sympathetic. But Wyndham had done things like, after they were breached the first time, they didn't scan their systems for the malware that was used in the first attack, and it was the same malware that was used in the second attack. So these are pretty, I think there is a little bit of an terrorum effect from the FTC suits. It's a threat that's out there, but there aren't so many of them that it's going to improve cybersecurity tremendously, but it is sort of knocking at very low-hanging fruit, and especially on the deceptive practices claims. So companies that are, saying Wyndham, for example, said that they used sort of commercial top-of-the-line security or reasonable security, and they weren't using any encryption, and they had default passwords. So sort of very basic things. I think that's been more the target of the FTC so far. I don't know that we can, they haven't written cybersecurity regulations. They're just going off of this unfair and deceptive practices. So that's not very fine-grained. They've used it fairly effectively in certain cases, but there's a limit to how much they can really push things along.
We also only have 2 commissioners right now, so.
Also that.
Eventually, when we start getting a full slate, we'll have a better sense, I think.
Yeah.
Sir?
Thank you. First, excellent panel. No hope, optimism yet, all doom and gloom. We've heard from the very fine keynote presentation over lunch about the synchronized, integrated, collaborative approach China is taking, both, putting aside the political attributes of that, government, industry working collaboratively, building a capability. In Europe, we see the GDPR, a regional, multinational, collaborative effort to stay current with technology. Can this panel offer us any hope to the problem that Larry mentioned? Modifying, deleting, changing the information inside the system. IBM's Director of Security said this year, 2017, is when we will begin to lose trust in our systems, not because of exfiltration, but because the data is being changed. Please, panel.
I actually have some help on this. There are a few new technologies that I've seen out there that are encrypting basically every word in an enterprise. Right now, are building a digital signature for every word in an enterprise. And if someone tries to change those words, you know that it has happened, right? And it is expensive to do it for a whole enterprise, but if you can narrow it down to a box, right, and say, our most valuable jewels are in this box, we're encrypting every word in this, we're putting a digital signature on every word in this box, if change happens to that we don't know about, we're going to know that. We're going to know about it. We're going to know which account it came from and how it was done and when it happened, and we can go back to the backups. I think there has been a lot of thought into this, and it's not just one company. There's 2 or 3 companies out there that have this technology. So I think it's looking pretty good.
And I would just add to that, from what I've seen over the course of the past 10 years, it seemed to me about 6 or 7 years ago, we hit an inflection point of tremendous amount more of investment in research and development in the security area, particularly in the hardware security area, and creating hardware roots of trust for deployments like that of cryptography, whether it's virtualized environments within servers or whether it's individual systems and encrypting data there. And so I think we're going to start seeing a lot of the fruits from all of that research and development and all the investment in the cybersecurity community. And so I think there's some rays of hope.
So the question is, do you encrypt your hard drive? I mean, you have at home information that's very sensitive, very important to you that you wouldn't want anybody to have, but most people don't encrypt their hard drive. And businesses, they right now are making a dollar and cents decision. It costs money to do special things, and this is a very expensive technology because it's so new. But as Ari said, I agree. The crown jewel should be protected with the most secure methodology available, but it's going to cost money.
We have a question from the overflow room. This is another one from Kyle Levenberg. And Kyle, your handwriting's improved markedly. And actually read this one. And basically what he's asking about, because the technology is evolving so much, what are we anticipating and how should we cope with the potential age of artificial intelligence? And how is that going to play into cybersecurity? I know that I think an article was written recently about using AI and cybersecurity, and there's some ethical issues to it and legal issues, but what does the panel think?
Well, I got a press call over lunch about I think a recording on Siri or something is being used in a criminal. Echo, yeah. So clearly I didn't take the call because I haven't learned enough about it. But and I was getting ready for this panel. But anyway, so there's that issue of AI being used more in that way, like with Siri, with Alexa in the home. I was just visiting my sister-in-law last week, and she has Alexa, and she was saying, "How cool is Alexa?" And I said, "Do you know she's listening all the time?" And this is, my college-educated sister-in-law, and she's like, "What?" So anyway, that's
Did Alexa answer when she said
yes, Alexa, because she didn't realize every time we were having this conversation about Alexa, every time someone said Alexa, the green light went on Alexa, and that's what we pointed out. Do you see every time the light's going on? So anyway, that's one aspect where we'll see AI, sorry, not a ray of sunshine, sorry. Another threat here where we use artificial intelligence in a way to improve our lives. Isn't it great? We can say, Alexa, how do you make risotto? And, that's a nice thing to do, but then there may be some costs that come with that. So that's just, when I hear that question, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Wait,
Can I build on? Sure. I just want to build on that slightly. I think the Alexa point is perfect because we're moving to a completely different network infrastructure. We're moving to a network infrastructure where we're going to have this tremendous number of distributed devices connected to themselves and back into the internet. We're going to have a tremendous amount more of computing that happens actually within the network, within the actual communications infrastructure. And then you've got back end, whether you want to call it the cloud or whether you want to call it just the enterprise data center. You're going to have artificial intelligence deployed across all of that. And what we need is a higher level of connectivity, and this is what the 5G promise is all about, to allow the right level of artificial intelligence to happen at the right place and the right, whether it's the data or the inferred data to transfer. If we can then use that artificial intelligence capability all through the network to predict the malicious attack behavior and stop it before it actually happens and use machine learning, there's tremendous potential and a lot of investment going in that direction.
I would say before would be, obviously that's the goal, but even just much more quickly after it started, right, I think is the short-term goal. I think that's more realistic for the short term.
And allow remediation.
I think a lot of people are talking about that. I think most security experts see it as still being, 10 to 15 years out because there's standards that would need to be created about what you're looking for to do it and to get everything focused on that. But even then, you'll still have, and I think this gets to the point, the hits that can happen to the AI, right? So if people start aiming at the AI and shutting that down and how that works, right? How do we stop that from happening and spiraling out of control? So I don't think it solves the problem, but there is some hope that maybe we can shut things down faster in the future.
Well, and it's not just a question of shutting down the AI, but actually corrupting the AI. This goes to the integrity issue too, right?
Especially if there's not transparency later on how the AI made a determination one way or another, which is a big accountability and transparency in artificial intelligence is a huge issue that I don't think we fully understand how we're going to attack that.
Which does remind me, is there anything that we can be done at this point about the Internet of Things that we, there's even now a camera inside your refrigerator for when you go to the store. I'm thinking if I ever get to the point where I need a camera inside my refrigerator, but evidently some people do. But there are millions of these devices out there. Are we just where we are, or is there anything that can be done, or any thoughts about that?
Well, we were having a heated discussion about this at lunch. So this is a big problem. My washing machine is connected to the internet. I don't know why. Maybe if it could move my laundry from the washer to the dryer, that would be helpful. But anyway, so we do see this explosion. Every manufacturer is putting connected internet access in the whatever it is, seemingly to improve it, even if it's not always obvious. But there really isn't much regulation, and certainly no one's following the suggested protocol. So you have these default passwords that are never changed, and so there are sort of easy things perhaps that we could start requiring, like no default passwords. But this is a massive problem. I think David's written extensively on Internet of Things. If I think you could add a lot more on the legal framework that's in place.
Yeah, well, I would just say quickly, I think there's actually a bunch of small problems that we should be able to solve. I mean, people hooking devices up to the internet that are set with default passwords are things that particularly we could use the standards environment and how the internet actually works to drive some compliance through to control some things. I mean, but right now we have a fundamental problem that we've got devices where there's not an incentive for the people who make them that are generally low margin devices to actually provide security updates. So if you find out that there was a flaw, how are you even going to get these things updated? We may move to the environment where it's just you're going to understand when you buy one of these things, hey, there's going to be an expiration date, and after about a year, I'm going to be replacing it with a new device. That could be one of the potential solutions.
One, just even consumer education would be helpful, right? Because you could have a manufacturer goes out of business, so even if they when they were in business, were trying to update their software. Once they're out of business, that's not happening. So consumer education has got to play a huge role.
So
Part of the problem too is that consumers don't actually have an incentive to take protective measures because these are externality problems. So if your router is part of a botnet that takes down a website, I mean, maybe you wanted to visit that website, but the fact that it's your router, it's not like it shuts down your internet, right? So this is an externality problem that consumers aren't properly incentivized in either.
And there are externality problems. One of the points I was going to get was there's externality problems for the companies too, right? I mean, for the manufacturers are the ones who have the most responsibility, but most of the U.S. manufacturers in this space are pretty responsible and have moved away from default passwords. It's small Chinese manufacturers whose products get on very cheaply that keep the old code, and so their cameras get hooked up to the internet, and the default passwords are available. So how do you hold them accountable? Well, you'd need the people who make the hardware, people who make the ISPs and others to take action to do it. But it's not their problem, right? They weren't the one who set it up. It doesn't hurt them in any way. Right. And then, as you said, for the consumer, if it's their device that's doing it, it doesn't harm them in any way. So there's a lot of people that need to take action, and we need to get to work together on this from a kind of collective good perspective. if you could do it without regulating, obviously that'd be better, because you can end up by basically saying, you know, that this, if you work together on this, this is how we stop from regulating. But sometimes that doesn't work. So at some point, you got to kind of draw the line and say, at what point are we going to have to regulate here?
I mean, I just push back a little bit that the consumers aren't harmed. I think they are. It depends on how the product is hacked into. I mean, if it's hacked into to surveil on your, you know, using your baby monitor to now, you know, spy on your baby or collect information about your home and how you use your home, I think that is a real scary thing for consumers. If it is just a distributed denial of service attack like we saw recently, I agree, but there isn't as much of an incentive. But certainly there are ways that household products could be used in a way that really would adversely impact the owners of those products.
Right, we made a
Might
determination.
mix up your laundry cycle.
Yeah. I mean, it's just weird. I don't understand. But.
All the way in the back, please.
Good afternoon. If we could start with the premise that cybersecurity is most effective when it's first employed, because once you tell everybody how it works, then see the adversary goes to work on defeating it. I'm wondering if we've had some really good discussion about some of the different mechanisms by which we turn, you know, some of this collaboration or info sharing, disclosure, sort of your traditional mechanisms of litigation or regulation, taxation, insurance, those sorts of things, into like carrots and sticks to get people to do things. I'm wondering what your thoughts are those mechanisms, do they cycle quickly enough, or do they process quickly enough where we can actually push out to turn them into actual security? You know, if you're looking at these, if you think of security as being the weakest chain as kind of the point of entry for your adversary, if it takes so long for some of these things like the draft EO or the NIST framework to get put into place by some of these organizations, that the cybersecurity is no longer actually effective. Do you think that those different mechanisms work quickly enough? And if not, what are some ways that we can speed that up so that as a whole our community is actually more secure?
So let me take that first, and then maybe get some comments. I think in my view, oftentimes legislation and regulation is not going to be the fastest way to do this, and instead what you need are public-private partnerships that come together and define best practices. I think, though, that the NIST cybersecurity framework actually created a model, since really what it does is it creates references to a lot of other standards, and standard setting activities actually provide oftentimes things that are like public-private partnerships where people get together who have technical expertise to define what compliance to the standard would be. I think that's the NIST cybersecurity framework largely got it right in a way that could have a huge impact, and we should be exploring more activity within the standard setting bodies in this instance.
So before I was talking about the weather, but I think the better example, I'll give you the hopeful example now, is fire, right? Like, you know, fire started, the reason that we have fire insurance in the U.S. is because Ben Franklin noticed that it was a problem at the founding of the country that we were having all of these fires, right? He promoted the idea of insurance as a solution and got out the idea of that we need to have some kinds of standards in this space. Building codes that formed around fire, you know, have prevented, you know, millions of fires. We have the fire department that responds if a fire were to happen. We just have a lot fewer people dying from fires and a lot fewer buildings going up in flames, percentage-wise, than we did 250 years ago. It's just a fact, right? So that is where we need to get to with cybersecurity as well. But all of that infrastructure needs to be put in place. And it takes a little while to get that stuff in place. So you can't say, well, does the EAO take too long to do? Yeah, it does, and then the reports are going to take 90 days, and then the solutions that come out of the reports will probably take 2 years. But if we don't start that process today, then that's not going to happen at all, right? So, and some of those things will be say, well, we need a public-private partnership on this, and that'll move faster, and that'll be the way. But at some point, it's got to start to get us to the point where we can build up all these processes like we have for fire codes, like we have for the electric grid, right, that came together in this way, made up of regulation, market forces, public-private partnerships, individuals being more aware, and education. You know, that's what the solution is going to be.
Well, I think we started that dialogue with this panel, and I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.